Okay, we are recording. Now I'm going to mute my microphone and then you go ahead, okay? You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go.
All right. This is Braden Bumpers. I'm one of the co-founders and head distillers at McClintock Distilling out here in Frederick, Maryland. And this is Gin Botanicals 101.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Sorry, I told you I wasn't going to stop. Is there a way that you can enable your camera and switch back and forth between the deck and your camera?
Let me see.
View options at the top if you have it, or maybe not at the top for you.
All right. This is Braden Bumpers, co-founder and head distiller at McClintock Distilling in Frederick, Maryland. And this is our Gin Botanical 101 session for the American Distilling Institute, presented by us and Mountain Rose Herbs. So this session is one that we like to do for either new distillers or distillers who are new to gin, to give you a 1,000-foot viewpoint on what gin is, some of the new changes that are happening to gin, and kind of give you the guidelines to start creating your own gin botanical recipe. So we can start with what gin is. So the TTB defines gin as a neutral spirit that is infused with juniper and other botanicals. And we can talk about a recent change in a second to that definition. Traditionally, it was a market that was dominated by a few major players, but in the last few years, craft producers have really started carving out a nice market share in the gin category, and are overtaking a lot of the Diageos and Suntories of the world at a higher growth than a lot of the other spirits out there. This year, it's expected to be a $2.5 billion market share in the U.S., and it's looking like gin as a whole will be about 7% growth for the next 3 years. One category that I think a lot of smaller craft distillers are looking at is the premium and super premium gins, which is growing at a really rapid rate. Last year was up 15.6%. So if you are a distillery that's looking to kind of capture the heat that gin has right now, now is a really, really good time, both domestically and for export as well. So there's been a few new TTB regs that have come about in the last few years. The standards of identity for gin used to be made with the neutral spirit made with juniper and other aromatics. And that statement and other aromatics are no longer required. So if you want to just do a juniper forward gin with nothing else, you can do that now. Two of the other more important changes is gin has been now allowed included into the bottled in bond standards of identity. So you can do a bottled in bond gin if it's aged in a barrel for 4 years. And they changed that. It used to be just paraffin lined barrels, so you're not getting any of the character of the barrel in your gin. They can be now non-lined oak containers. So if you're doing a barrel aged gin for several years, you can do a bottled in bond gin. And I think the most exciting change is that the TTB is now allowing age statements for gin. So I think barrel aged gins are a kind of a segment of the gin market that is primed to really kind of take off. We've seen a lot more in the last few years, and it's a really exciting segment of the market. So if you are new to production, there are a bunch of different ways to make gin in terms of your operations. And I just want to highlight kind of the different methods there are. So bathtub or maceration gin is really popular for at-home distillers. It's a great way to start playing around with your recipe. That just involves soaking your botanicals in a finished spirit to extract the flavor and color. And you'll get a pretty good indication of what kind of extraction you're expected to get out of gin's. Particularly good if you're using new botanicals or other ingredients that you're not very familiar with. It's always interesting to see, you can tweak the proof that you're extracting at to kind of pull different compounds out of even common botanicals. Not a ton of macerated gins on the market right now. Probably most common would be distilled gins, which are gins that's made through a maceration, and then you take that spirit, put it back into your still, and then distill that compound through. So you have a clear gin, but still it'll carry over the oils and flavor compounds in the distillation process. Another method is compound gin, which is a good way, especially if you're starting to experiment with flavors, where you can either do a macerated gin or a distilled gin, but you distill each different botanical separately, and then you create your gin by mixing those in certain ratios in your final product. Vapor infused is another way to produce gin rather than adding your botanicals to the spirit, either pre or post distillation. You'll actually be putting it in a chamber in your still and actually distilling the vapors through the botanicals. This is you can use a little bit more delicate botanicals this way. You don't have to worry about direct heat quite as much. And it's a good way to kind of more evenly pull different flavor profiles out of your botanicals. Probably Bombay kind of popularized vapor infused gins, and now we're seeing a lot on the smaller distillery side of things. And this can be as simple as hanging a cheesecloth, or I have seen a sock used in the top of your still. You can get specialized gin baskets with O-rings and seals to make sure that every ounce of vapor is passing through the botanicals. Kind of some of the newer ways to make gin is using vacuum or pressure extractors to take out the flavor compounds of the botanicals. This is a technology that was borrowed from some pharmaceutical companies. And there are a handful of distilleries, notably Durham Distillery down in North Carolina. They're using this to make their gin. It's really neat because it requires very low to no heat, so you can use botanicals that aren't able to be used in the other methods. The downside with this is they are very, very expensive to get. So if you're starting out, it's probably better to use some of the top four. You can also use make flavored gins and just buy concentrates and extracts from companies. And you can just add it to a neutral spirit and you're done. It's probably the easiest way to make gin. It's really tough to kind of capture the same flavors you're getting out of botanicals that you will get with flavor extracts. And a lot of people do combinations. So if you have a particularly complex botanical recipe, maybe you'll want to macerate some of your botanicals and vapor infuse some of your other botanicals, and then add a flavoring extract post-distillation. So it really, really depends on your operation and the ingredients that you are using to make your gin of what works best for you. So some of the other considerations that you'll want to take into account before you start your gin production. Costs is obviously, from a business perspective, first and foremost. It's really fun to use, really rare, really expensive ingredients, but unless you are hitting that super premium price point, it's going to be really tough to recoup that. When you're setting up how you want to distill or macerate or extract your flavors, it's good to run some experiments and kind of determine which botanicals you're using, which botanicals diffuse their oils better or worse in these different methodologies, and which kinds of profiles you want to extract. So, for instance, juniper, if you are using a vapor extraction, you won't get quite as much of the alpha pinene compounds coming out as if you are macerating them. So even though it is the same botanical, these different production methods will extract different oils and different flavors of your gin. And the last thing to consider is the heat tolerance. Really delicate botanicals, we've played around with a lot of particularly floral elements, will not extract at higher temperatures. They'll just be destroyed by high heat. And some botanicals, you'll be extracting really, really non-desirable compounds at different temperatures, where if you can keep it at a lower temperature, you'll extract some really nice, complex profiles. So always good to run experimentations, and there's plenty of really good resources on ABI in terms of botanicals and flavor profiles. So when you are selecting your botanical profile, you can make something that's very unique, that has a completely different twist, but you'll kind of want to find a general style which your gin will fall under. It makes it a lot easier to sell it. It makes it a lot easier to pitch it to bars and restaurants. That is, you know, if you have a London dry style gin, I have something that is like a London dry style gin. So we'll talk about kind of the bigger types that are out there, and which ones are more or less popular. So Genever, we always start with Genever. It was the first iteration of gin. The Dutch came up with it in the 17th century. And the biggest difference with Genever is that it is going to be distilled at a lower proof, so that you will get the flavor of your distillate through as part of the final flavor profile of your spirit. So traditional Dutch Genevers are made with malted barley, and you'll get that malty, oily, barley forward flavor in your final distillate. And Genevers are really fun because if you think of gin like you are painting on a blank canvas, you can use any botanical you want to kind of create this unique flavor profile to you. But with Genever, you're already starting with a half-finished canvas. That flavor profile of the spirit itself is going to give you a starting block. So it's really fun to play around with these. We did a collaboration Genever using a rye base, and that already had a ton of peppery, kind of dark malty notes. And we were able to accentuate that with the botanicals that we have chosen. There's a lot of really cool examples of kind of modern Genevers, as well as your classic. I have some classic Genevers that have been around for hundreds of years in the picture as well. Traditionally, the juniper is going to be pretty prevalent in a Genever, but you can sweeten it up with either sweet botanicals, sugar, honey, sweet wine, berries. There's a lot of fun ways to do it. Genever is speaking from personal experience, a kind of tough sell in the market. It's a really fun specialty spirit, but definitely a sliver of the market share compared to London Dry and American aromatic styles. London Dry still dominates the industry. This is now moving forward. Unlike Genever, all of these other styles of gin are made with a neutral base. So you aren't necessarily pulling a ton of flavor out of whatever distillate that you're using. So if you are producing that from scratch, you'll need some kind of rectification or coffee still. You really need a clean spirit base. And a traditional London Dry is really kind of characterized by a dominant juniper character. So even a lot of the big brands, though, will have other components to it. Like if you get a Beefeater or the Tanqueray, the Sipsmiths, you will still, they do utilize other botanicals. So a common misconception I hear from new distillers all the time is London Dries are easy to make. You just throw in the juniper and you're done. Generally, a lot of these brands, traditionally a London Dry will utilize either angelic or orris root. They'll usually utilize cardamom. They'll usually utilize coriander. Typically, you'll also see some other component to them. So almonds, you have this nice like rooty finish to it. So citrus and spice do still play a role in a London dry style gin. Old Toms, starting to become more popular. An Old Tom gin is characterized by being sweetened post-distillation. So you can use honey, you can use a simple syrup or sugar, you can use fruit juice, you can kind of play around with it a little bit, but it does need to be on the sweeter side of things. Old Toms, I think, are the most popular I see as barrel-aged gins, but does not necessarily need to be barrel-aged. I'm seeing a lot more and more Old Tom gin, so I think this is, just from my personal experience, a category of gin that we'll see kind of some nice growth over the next few years in. Definitely the most popular in the US is contemporary style gin. You know, I've heard it called a lot of different names, new wave, aromatic, American, but really it's kind of characterized by having a flavor profile that isn't necessarily dominated by juniper berries. So you can have sweeter ingredients, you can have spicy ingredients. It's really kind of whatever you can come up with that kind of falls under this American or contemporary style umbrella. It's really fun, probably our favorite here, because you can really kind of go crazy with the ingredients that you're using. And it's a lot of fun to balance that juniper rather than have it be kind of the pillar at which you're building off of. Navy Strength is another one that we're seeing a lot of growth on recently. Really the only definition of a Navy Strength gin is it is required to be 57% ABV or higher. Typically, when you have a mix of oils in there, the ones that tend to be expressed the most at this higher ABV are brighter and more citrus forward components. So you'll tend to see that a lot in Navy Strength gins, as there's some kind of citrus element to it to kind of brighten up this very hot spirit. And flavor gins, probably the most well-known is slow gin. A lot of them are classified as liqueurs, use slow berries or relatives to the plum, and you sweeten and flavor it post-distillation with artificial and natural flavors. I won't spend too much time on slow gins. They're really neat, but they're kind of outside the breadth of what we usually talk about in gins. And then this is another category that's really kind of starting to take off, which is gin of a unique character. So this is kind of a gin that has a dominant flavor that is not juniper. So these almost, you know, I've had some gins of unique characters that I would almost classify as like an herbal infused vodka. There's very little juniper characteristics to it. So, you know, some of the more popular flavors I've seen in the market: lavender, hibiscus, sage, cucumber, honey, chamomile. There's a lot of these kind of gin of unique characters that are out there. And they're really fun. One piece of advice I've heard from a colleague who makes a gin like this is that you can become kind of pigeonholed when you're selling to bars and restaurants. So, you know, they can kind of push you off to the side, and when they're redoing their cocktail menus the next season around, you'll be like, well, your gin is really only good for the spring, so I only use it for my spring cocktails, and you can get kind of lose good selling opportunities that way. So just something to keep in mind. Another thing we really try to push for most of the distilleries we work with and helping them get set up with gins is keep in mind the big three. So I think the last data I have is from 2 years ago, that over 90% of the gin in the US was drinking in one of these 3 cocktails, 68% being the gin and tonic. So gin is a very unique spirit compared to other spirits. You're looking at whiskey, vodka, tequila, in that gin is really kind of limited to it's the only spirit that has 3 cocktails that dominate the spirit. So pretty much anytime you're doing a recipe, if we're doing a new gin, we always test it out in these 3, and it really needs to hit on at least one of them. So if you're making a really specialty gin and it's great in a gin and tonic but doesn't work in a martini or Negroni, that's fine. But the vast majority of at-home drinkers and a lot of bars and restaurants are going to be looking at how your gin fits in these 3. So definitely be aware of that. It's a kind of a weird quirk of gin. That's not to say that gin is not, evolving. Like, we're seeing a lot of the trends in the craft industry, in that a lot of specialty cocktails, a lot of high-end cocktail bars are utilizing gin in really interesting and cool ways. But for the vast majority of the country, if you're looking at multiple markets, you'll want to keep these 3 in the back of your head. So this next part is kind of looking at botanicals, and we gave kind of general guidelines of percentages and what you'll be looking at when you're formulating your recipe. When we do our taste evaluations, we break it down into these 6 categories, and we kind of rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 and try to balance them as best as possible. But you'll see, this is a graph I took of a lot of the major brands of gin. You'll see a lot of overlap. So I'll have at the top of each one of these categories that we're looking at, I have some more common use botanicals for gins, and then I have a bunch of cool alternatives that you can use for your gin as well. So looking at the big brands, you'll see coriander is there a lot. You'll see almonds is there a few times. You'll see orris root is utilized a lot. So a lot of the ones we've already hit on, you will see commonly in gin. So the first and arguably most important, anytime we're doing a gin, is we look at the juniper. So what do we want this gin to be? If you're doing a London dry style gin, obviously this is going to be the most important part of your gin, since it's going to make up the majority of your botanical mix and of the profile. You'll see of this graph here, there are a lot of different compounds that you can get out of juniper. The majority, the alpha pinene, this one is going to make up 40 to 45% of the berry. So that's going to be the most dominant, but you can get some complexity out of these juniper berries, and you can kind of play that up with your other botanicals. So there are citrus components, minty components, earthy, woody. There's a lot of complexity to juniper, which is why gin is such a beautiful spirit.
I'm going to interrupt you right there. I don't know if we can trim this out, but it's alpha pinene.
Pinene, thank you.
Yes, saponine, limonene, those are the terpenes.
Gotcha.
Okay, so do that section over and we'll try to just edit this out.
Perfect. All right, so first up is the juniper berry. We're looking at always going to be the first stop at when you are making a new gin botanical mix. Obviously, if you're doing a London dry or a more dry style gin, juniper is going to make up the majority of your botanical mix and your flavor profile. So put in here a breakdown of a lot of the compounds that you will be finding in your juniper berry. 40 to 45% of this is going to be, I always mess up this name, alpha pinene. And that is going to be, your classic gin, that piney kind of bitter, more astringent note. But there are a lot of other compounds that will be coming out of your gin that you can play up with other botanicals. So there's citrus components, minty, earthy, woody, you know, kind of more of a bark spice flavor. Probably the vast majority of gin is made with the common juniper, but there are a few other varietals of juniper berries that have been used in gin that I put down here at the bottom. Juniper, since this is such a core element of your gin, you know, I like to view juniper like how a lot of the winemakers view their grapes, in that depending on where it's grown, depending on what time it's harvested, depending on how long it's dried, is going to change these compounds and the concentrations at which they will be in the juniper. So even if you are getting common juniper, you know, one common juniper is not going to be the same profile as you'll get out of a common juniper grown in a different part. So if you're doing a contemporary gin or more modern gin, you can dial this down to, you know, 50 down to as low as 10% if you're looking for like a gin if you need character. The next part we look at is citrus. So two very common ones for gin production is orange peel and lemon peel. For a dry gin, you will still have a component of citrus in your gin. Old Tom, you'll want to go a little bit higher with that. And contemporary, again, you can go higher, lower, however you want to go with that. Contemporary, you can really mix and match. Some good alternatives that we've had good luck with. Bitter orange peel is a really, really fun one. You get a lot of the kind of citrus brightness without adding a ton of sweetness to it. So if you're looking for something that plays off a little bit more of the bitter components of the juniper, that's a good one. Lime peel is great. We've used grapefruit, both the fruit and the skin. And lemongrass we put in a lot of our gins, a really fun ingredient to use. It is not necessarily it's not a citrus plant, but does have a lot of those kind of bright, more acidic citrus notes to it. The next is the sweet category. So this is you know, coriander and chamomile are two very popular ones I see a lot. For a dry gin, you'll probably still want to add a little bit, 10%. Probably coriander is the traditional London dry sweet component. For a contemporary gin, you can boost this up. And if you want to do, we've seen an Old Tom gin that has very little sugar in it, and they achieved a lot of their sweetness from using sweeter botanicals. Some other alternatives that we've used, honeysuckle is a great one. Honey and fruit juice is a good one to play around with. Elderflower, hibiscus, rose petals. This is going to cover most of your floral notes as well, and there is a ton of them out there. So really fun one to play around with. Next is savory. We recommend less is more with a lot of this stuff. So for our most popular gin, we utilize fennel and a little bit of cinnamon and ginger, and it makes up less than 5% of our total botanical mix by weight, but is still a very dominant flavor in the finished product. So a lot of these are fun to play around with, but you know, balance is always very key if you're trying to make like a contemporary gin. So popular ones I see a lot: rosemary, sage, caraway, cinnamon, ginger. We've played around with all of these down below. Cucumber has been a very popular one recently, with Hendrix being such a dominant player in the market. Cucumber is one that we usually use fresh. Most of these botanicals I like to get in dry, but cucumber, because it is so water soluble, is nice as a fresh cucumber. One quick piece of advice that we found out the hard way is if you are using cucumber or any fresh fruits, make sure they are unwaxed, because if they're not, the heat will take the wax right off, and you'll have a really fun time cleaning out your still to get rid of all of that. So that is the savory component here. Spice is another one that is very common in even London dry gins. Cardamom is probably the most popular that I see out there that have been used for gin production for a long time. Ginger, anise, peppermint leaf, again, kind of less is more in that category. A lot of these, particularly like the anise, the grains of paradise, cumin, can get really, really overwhelming if you are using them in a gin. So I like to have a little bit of spice in all of the gins that you do, but even if you're doing the Old Tom, you put a little bit of some of these sweeter components in there, you know, your cinnamons or gingers that will kind of complement that. You don't have to use cardamom or allspice, anything like that. And then the last, you're looking at your rooty elements or some of your fixatives. So the two most popular fixatives that have been used is orris root and angelica root. And for a proper fixative, we recommend 100 to 200 grams per 100 liter of neutral spirit charge. So this does contribute some flavor to the spirit, but what it more importantly does is it has chemical properties that help bond the botanical oils to the alcohol molecules in your product. So one, this helps keep the flavor in your spirit. I've definitely tried some gins that didn't have enough fixatives that had been sitting for a while and had reverted back to almost a vodka. And two, it will help keep the consistency of the flavor throughout the spirit itself. So if you have a big vat of gin and you don't give enough time for fixation and you're not using fixatives, sometimes the first bottle you bottle can taste very different from the last bottle you bottle. So we generally recommend 6 to 8 weeks after you distill a gin to proof it and let it fixate, so you don't get some of those problems we just talked about. We have experimented with chicory root and cranesville root that do have fixative properties, but I would recommend, even if you go down the road of one of those two, still including either orris or angelica as well in smaller quantities. So some of the other botanical considerations, if you're picking your mix, is kind of common versus unusual. By buying some of these common botanicals, you know, I'll start by saying if you are buying an unusual botanical to kind of create differentiation and to make a product that isn't readily found in the market right now is awesome. That's a great way to separate yourself from the other gins that are out there, but you need to make sure that whoever is providing this to you can do it on a regular basis. So supply chain and quality assurance are really, really important. So if you want to, you know, pick some very weird wild forage root that grows native to you, and you have somebody that goes out and forages it for you, you know, if you scale up your operation, they might not be able to scale up their production on that. So it's really important to kind of evaluate your brand and how you want it to grow to the ingredients that you'll be bringing in. You know, I've seen, we have one gin that uses some kind of hard to get botanicals, and we've had to pull it for months at a time because we could not get quality ingredients in a regular basis. The other thing to consider is fresh versus dried botanicals. I know we talked a little bit about cucumber, and I like to use it fresh versus dried. But a lot of these, pretty much all of our other botanicals, we get in dried, and I prefer it that way. One, because the shelf life is better if they're sealed properly. They will keep for a very long time. The other is the extraction. So because a lot of fresh botanicals hold their weight in water, if you are doing your botanical mix by weight or volume, you'll want to use, the general rule of thumb is 3 times as much fresh botanicals as you would for dried botanicals, because a lot of that weight and volume is taken up by water. Talk about our suppliers. There are a lot of different botanical suppliers out there. It is really important to talk to suppliers before you start getting your ingredients, because the quality of your botanicals will vary, sometimes wildly different from supplier to supplier. So ask them what their quality assurance is. Ask them if they don't get a good batch in, if they can source from other places, or if they just take it off supply for a little while. And be sure to ask them what lead times are for specific products, just so you can have that on. Not all suppliers are equal. I'll just leave it at that. And then the last is how you want to prepare your botanicals. So you can buy them whole, granulized, or powdered, most of these. We usually buy most of ours whole. And then we put them through a food processor and blend them down before we put them in. Obviously, the finer you go with these botanicals, the more surface area there will be for the alcohol to extract the flavor components. So they will extract faster, or if you're doing a vapor infused, better, the smaller you go. But if you go too small, we've used a powdered product, and with the force of our vapor extraction, it actually burped up powder up all through our condenser, and it was a really big pain to clean out. So I usually recommend whole or granulized. Powdered is really tough to deal with. And if you're using it for a distilled gin and you're macerating it, sometimes, depending on your heating element, can provide problems for that as well. So sometimes powdered is all there is out there. There's nothing wrong with using it. Just make sure you know what you're getting yourself into before you order a bunch of powdered botanicals. And then the last thing I always like to talk about is the growing conditions. So there is a lot of differentiation in the finished botanical depending on soil conditions, depending on sunlight hours, depending on when it's harvested, depending how much water it got. So if you want to, it's really fun to kind of play off the terroir of something local to you. You know, I've had common juniper grown here versus common juniper grown on the West Coast that had pretty different compounds that we were extracting out of them. They're still the same compounds, but the concentrations of all those different elements are going to be different depending on the terroir and growing conditions and harvest time. So it's a fun way to tell your story, but it definitely reach out to your suppliers, see if you can go out, talk to them, pick at different times of the year, experiment with them, see what works best for your recipe. But definitely something to keep in mind when you're ordering botanicals. And that pretty much wraps it up. We are always happy to help new distillers or new gin distillers with whatever we can. So email us. We're happy to help. We've helped a lot of people get their recipes up and running. And come out and visit us if you're ever in Maryland. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Braden. What we'll do now is have time for questions, and that's what we'll just bump over to